Hello everyone, and welcome to my truly worryingly in-depth discussion of my favourite band, Steely Dan, and in particular the seemingly endless ups and downs they faced in recording their 7th record, Gaucho. So let me try my absolute best to keep the context brief. Steely Dan are a rock band founded in 1971 by keyboardist and lead singer Donald Fagen and guitarist and bassist Walter Becker. The duo met at college in New York and eventually got the chance to form a band, which they recorded and toured 3 records with. However, the two socially introverted literature students were supremely uncomfortable with performing to a crowd, so, seeing as they wrote all the songs anyway, they essentially fired their entire band and ceased touring altogether, instead bringing in countless session musicians to assist in recording their next 3 albums. Over these records, they further honed into the elements that are arguably most definitive to their style, the heavy influence of jazz, a unique lyrical style that revolves around strange or humorous situations and characters, and a rigorous emphasis on production quality. Our story starts after the release of 1977's Asia, a critical and commercial success that remains one of their most celebrated to this day. Riding this wave, they began work on the Tumultuous follow-up. With Asia, Fagen and Becker had set the gold standard for audio fidelity in pop music, an obsession of theirs which had pushed all involved to their limits from their debut. On Gaucho, however, this perfectionism reached almost comical heights. Take for instance the album's opening track, Babylon Sisters, where the mixing alone took Fagen and Becker, along with their engineer Roger Nichols and producer Gary Katz, 274 tries to be satisfactory in their eyes. 55 of these mixes were concentrated on the fade-out alone. Furthermore, the album's title song was nearly scrapped altogether as they were unable to get a solid drum track, often disposing of entire pieces for this reason alone. Gary Katz, however, was adamant on keeping it, and so stayed up the entire night with drummer Jeff Porcaro and manually edited together a drum track from 85 different takes, comprising 35 edits for the one singular drum track. On tape. And these are just cherry-picked examples. Gaucho, with over 40 players credited, may have only featured slightly more than their previous record, but it was the first to feature songs that, with the exception of Fagen's vocals, neither of them even played on. It was a truly monolithic effort all around, and whatever limits had before confined their perfectionism were well and truly vanquished. But by this point, most of their players were seasoned professionals who understood their process. Nonetheless, some outsiders were still taken aback, with a notable example being Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits, who was asked to play on the track Time Out of Mind. Unaware of what he was truly in for, Knopfler later described the process as like getting into a swimming pool with lead weights tied to your boot. And though the commonly circulated rumour that they only ultimately used 15 seconds of his playing is untrue, it does illustrate the reckless abandon Fagen and Becker had for time, for money, and for the well-being of themselves and others. There were limits even for them though. As discussed, drum tracks had long been the chief hurdle in the way of attaining what they desired. But when Roger Nichols told them he could solve this problem with a custom-built drum machine for $150,000, even they couldn't justify such a price for minuscule improvements in quality. Just kidding, they gave him the money and he built a fucking custom drum machine from scratch. It was named Wendell and it was used for the bass drum track on 3 of the album's 7 songs. No machine like this really existed yet, at least not in widespread commercial use, and though Nichols didn't invent the drum machine with Wendell, the lunacy of this achievement cannot be understated. And then things went from rocky to disastrous. The most significant catastrophe to befall the recording of Gaucho is the tragedy of the second arrangement. This was the track nearing completion in late 1979 and a personal favourite of the band and production staff. However, due to a miscommunication, the master tape was wiped by a studio engineer in December. But no worries, they could just use a backup tape, right? Well, guess who didn't make backup tapes because it would have imperceptibly reduced the quality? Today, through many decades of found tapes and bootleg remasters, the second arrangement can be heard in as close a state to completion as is possible, and was even played live in 2011. But no official release does or ever shall exist. It's customary for Dan worshippers like myself to ask for 2.5 hours silence when discussing this track, but I think we can skip that for now. On top of these recording struggles, Becker was hit by a car during the album's making and lost his girlfriend to a drug overdose. Moreover, a string of legal issues surrounded the album over its release and pricing, and Fagen and Becker were sued by jazz pianist Keith Jarrett, who claimed the title track borrowed too heavily from his 1974 piece, Long As You Know You're Living Yours. Eventually he was awarded a writing credit, making it one of only 3 tracks on a Steely Dan record not solely credited to Fagen and Becker. Ultimately, the album was, like Asia, a critical and commercial success, with its lead single Hey 19 even reaching number 10 in the US. But after everything, Fagen and Becker broke up the Steely Dan name the following year. After spending the 80s mostly working apart, they began recording and touring again from the early 90s up until Becker's death in 2017. I realise that I haven't said much of my own thoughts on Gaucho, though you can probably intuit that I like it. Still, if I were to be pedantic, I would say that it is a step down from Asia, which is to my mind their clear magnum opus, and that the struggle of its very existence shines through. Love it as I do, it is a dark, sparse, emotionally cold and deeply clinical piece of music that lacks the warmth and meticulously orchestrated sense of spontaneity that their earlier albums have. Despite this though, its brilliant blending of jazz with rock and pop and its darkly sardonic lyrical vignettes still come together to form one of their finest works. And for all the struggle of this album's recording, it was a struggle that was inseparable from the bizarre, one-of-a-kind vision of Fagen and Becker, and produced a collection of songs that epitomizes what makes Steely Dan so special, at least to me. Thanks for watching.